happy to be here.
Cool.
Well, we're
Um,
happy to have
Wanna
you.
jump into the first question?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, actually, let me just say something, full disclosure. I was one of a group of makeup effects artists that worked on the show. Like I said, in Vancouver, there really wasn't an established makeup effects industry at the time, and X-Files kind of fueled that. And at the time, I was working for a guy named Toby Lindala. You've probably seen his name.
Yeah.
He was the makeup effects designer on the show. That's who I worked for. And I worked with several other people. We kind of, it was one of those situations where, you couldn't just call the union and say, send out every makeup effects guy you've got, because there really weren't any. There were a couple of people that had opportunities along the way, usually working with an LA artist that was brought in to do something. But in terms of building stuff for the show and then handling it on set, it just didn't really exist. So we were kind of the genesis of that in Vancouver, as I understand it. And I'm just saying that because I don't want you to think that I was the head of makeup effects on the show. I was a group of about maybe a dozen people over the years that it was here, and some of them are top artists in the field now, and some have retired from the field.
How did you get involved in it? If it's such if it's at the time, it was such an unusual thing up there. How did you get involved?
Involved in X-Files or makeup
No,
effects?
in makeup effects.
Well, it's interesting because now makeup effects and makeup and almost anything to do with filmmaking, there's schools for it. You can go, any major center has film schools, and you can learn it, and it's easy to find. Like Vancouver has the Vancouver Film School that teaches a lot of film things, but also makeup effects, and it's a big program. When I started, Vancouver Film School had a flyer, like a one sheet that you'd find at a bus stop. And on that sheet was like a 3-week makeup course. So I looked at those courses and thought, well, I've already kind of figured out most of this myself, so I can't really justify going to school for it. But a lot of the people in my generation and before me, we just took an interest in this from watching films. And again, I'm old. This is pre-internet. So you basically got your hands on a couple of books, because there really were only a couple of books out there that detailed this stuff. And then you scrounged around to find materials, and you started learning the base skills of makeup effects, like sculpting, mold making, casting, painting, airbrush, and then you get into the actual application of makeup and that kind of stuff, which is, more learned on the job if you're not, like I did Halloween makeups on my brother and my friends, and that's where I kind of first learned application. But really, I didn't learn application until I got on set. But before that, I was sculpting, molding, making things. The things right up there on the shelf are falling apart, crumbling things that I did for student films and personal projects. I mean, Jason here, that was a Halloween makeup I made for myself decades ago.
That's crazy.
Yeah, so it was very much learn on your own.
Yeah.
And then and I grew up in a small northern town, population 3,000. So there really wasn't, I couldn't go to any supply stores to get things. Everything I used was brought in. I used to say, like, I would literally buy a 50-pound bag of plaster to make molds from a Vancouver company and have it shipped to my town on a Greyhound bus. And I paid more in shipping than plaster. And everything I did, I had to source it out and get it shipped. And again, this is all pre-Amazon, everybody having an online store. So you were calling up stores in Vancouver and LA and saying, can you ship this to Canada? So it was a lot of just figure it out as you go. And then that's what the X-Files was. Most of us, basically, the people that ended up working in makeup effects on the shop had done what I did as a child. Like, I started when I was 12. I found a book that inspired me, and I spent my teens and early 20s tinkering on my own to figure it out. And there were people just like me, Mike Fields, one of the lead artists on X-Files when it was here. He grew up in New Brunswick, and he had moved to Florida to take a makeup course. And then he learned that they were shooting X-Files in Vancouver, and he literally moved to Vancouver to get on that show. So a lot of us have stories like that where, I mean, I went to university, got out of university, didn't know what I was doing next, and started asking questions. And a longtime friend of mine was working at an animation company, and he knew Gillian Anderson's ex-husband. And I said, can you find out anything from him about the X-Files? Again, pre-internet, you can't just go online and find a phone number or an email. So I got a number and I called Toby and I said, hey, this is what I've been doing in my basement since I was 12. Would you have any, opportunities for me? And he brought me in for an interview. And he said, yeah, I don't know. I think we're kind of winding down this season, maybe next season. And then a week later, he called me in and said, can you start now? Because this was basically 5, 6, 7 people in a shop that had been in Toby's basement and had recently moved to an actual industrial building. And we were just making it up as we went.
That's amazing.
So, yeah, and that's kind of where we all came from. Like nowadays, almost everybody goes through some sort of schooling, and then they get an internship in a shop, and then they figure out whether they want to work in a shop or on set, and they go from there. But for my generation, we basically made stuff in the garage, in the basement, until we were old enough to looking for a way to make it pay the bills. And for my generation, X-Files was the genesis, the place.
Without going crazy, to go and I'll specifically say for postmodern Prometheus, I'm assuming when I was reading about your work on that, I'm assuming that was for his mask, for Chris Owen's mask, and building all that. What would the process for something like that be? Make it animatronic too, right? One of the eyes, the other eye moved, and the mouth. I mean, what you guys did was so cool.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that one up, because to be honest, I spent just under 3 years on the X-Files. I was there for part of 3, 4, and 5. And then it moved to LA. And a lot of it's a blur because it was wild and crazy. We worked about 100 hours a week and nonstop, exhausted. And it was in the shop and then on set. And in season 5, which I believe Postmodern Prometheus was season 5,
Yep.
I was co-keying the show with another artist. Her name's Leanne Potvin. At that point, Toby was delegating. So he had us, Leanne and myself, heading up alternating episodes. And I think I must have been running Prometheus because I did work on it. I ended up applying his makeup with Leanne. And I was the animatronic puppeteer that was running his second face offset, which is, when we all started on X-Files, we basically fell into different slots. Like I said, some people, they don't like the stress of being on a film set, so they work in the shop. And some people love the film set. Like I later on decided that's where I wanted to be. So I primarily work on set now. But back then, one of the things that what Toby saw in me, I guess, is that I had the disposition to work on set. So I was doing that, but I was also mechanical, and I had built animatronics as a kid. And so when things like animatronics came up in the episodes, I was usually building them. I'm trying to remember how much. I don't remember doing a lot of hands-on building on Prometheus because I was probably doing something else. But yeah, it was a pretty advanced rig for what we had been doing, because it was an animatronic that was part of a makeup. And it's, with prosthetic makeups, the simplest description is that you take an impression of the actor's face or whatever body part is involved. You make a positive. I'm looking around to see if I have one, but I don't really. Well, there's some Arnold Schwarzeneggers up there.
Oh wow!
And that one over there by the tree, that's an interesting one, because that's Ryan Reynolds.
Oh, is that from Deadpool?
It's from Wolverine Origins.
Oh, Wolverine Origins. Okay.
Yeah, I worked on the reshoots for that, and it's kind of ironic because Ryan played Deadpool in that film, and everybody hated it, including him. And on that, I didn't do Ryan's makeup; I did Ryan's stunt double, and but I was there for it. And then years later, I got to do Deadpool and Deadpool 2. But I digress. So you make an impression of the actor's face, you create a positive, and then you'll sculpt the makeup on it, and you reproduce that sculpture in foam, or nowadays it's silicone, and then you glue it to the actor's face and paint it, blend it and paint it. But when an animatronic is involved in a makeup, you have to build something that goes underneath the makeup and is secured well enough. And in this case, I can't really remember how I feel like it was just sort of a piece that went, like often an animatronic on an actor it'll involve like a full skull cap and then a frame, an armature underneath the makeup that moves the skin. And that's essentially what this did, but I feel like it was a smaller piece. It didn't actually go over his whole head. It just sort of went on the side of his face and was held in place by the makeup and probably glued to his face underneath the makeup, because there wasn't a lot to it, as I recall. It was mostly an eye that moved around and a mouth that opened and closed a little bit. But yeah, I think Toby and Leanne and I applied that makeup. And then later it was Leanne and I doing the bulk of the episode. And like I said, I was operating the face usually. I remember one scene in the back of a car where he was sitting beside Gillian Anderson, and I made the face move, and it scared her. They don't always know when it's going to move, and sometimes they don't even know it's going to move. Animatronics are like that. The actors get there and they think, oh, it's a monster face, and then it blinks and they lose their mind. But yeah, it was fun. And I mean, Chris Carter was directing that. It was always fun when Chris was more involved, hands-on. It's certainly a memorable episode due to its black and white nature and the story it was telling.
Favorite effect or a challenging effect that you remember from working on the X-Files that you might be able to share with us?
Oh, like I said, it's kind of a blur. So let me think. Well, really, I mean, postmodern Prometheus was exciting because it's always great when you're working on like a main character, because sometimes you're on a show and you're, say it's a zombie show and you're doing the zombies, which is great. But sometimes the monster is just the background, it's just, they're not featured, and your work sometimes doesn't get featured. But when you are attached to the title character or the main character, lead characters, like in the case of postmodern Prometheus or Deadpool, as I like to tell people when they ask me what I did on Deadpool, I say Deadpool, because you can't get around that. But yeah, postmodern, he was fun because he was a main character. And as my career's gone on, I sort of divide it between makeup effects and puppeteering. And when you're puppeteering a character or an element, you're actually part of the story and the performance. And I personally feel more involved when I'm doing that kind of work. So for postmodern, I felt quite involved, and it was rewarding. I think what else we did. I mean, you can't overlook the home episode, because I'd imagine you were going to ask about that one. That was an episode that when we were doing it, we were just overwhelmed with how much stuff we had to do in that episode. And there were times where we were like, how could this even be on network television? Like, one of my favorite stories from that episode was that I'm sure you know who Kim Manners is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was a Kim Manners episode, and we were filming the scene in the kitchen where they have just birthed the child and they're cutting the umbilical cord with a dirty fork. And Kim Manners turned to the crew and just said, I will probably never work again after this. After this gets out, I'll be done. But yeah, that was another episode where we did so many crazy things that it was a blast. And again, I was involved in doing this guy's makeup.
Oh, wow.
Edmund Peacock. So
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
again, Toby designed this and he and I applied it and got the makeup going, and then I took over the makeup for the rest of the episode. So again, doing a featured character in the episode instead of just somebody with a slash throat or somebody with a, whatever. It makes it, memorable and fun. Here's another image I found when I was house cleaning during the pandemic.
Oh, there's Kim.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's Kim with his brothers in the episode.
oh yeah,
It's
I kind of do look like they're related.
yeah, those are the home characters. I'm sorry, it's not the best way to show things, but
Wow.
anyway.
How does it feel to be part of something that will never air on television again?
Yeah, it was pretty exciting because, like I said, at the time we didn't know what the hell we were doing, and it just seemed like a pretty wild episode for the X-Files. And then when it aired, the response to it was, "This can never air again. This is too much." And then it became a fan favorite, and they always talk about it. So, I mean, I'm happy. That's kind of how the film industry works, like when we made Deadpool, we had no idea whether the superhero fans would like Deadpool, whether it would click or whether it would be too edgy for the Marvel universe fandom. And it went, they loved it. It went nuts. So this movie that was relatively small compared to some of the big Avenger movies is now, it's just amazing to have been there for it. And working on something like the home episode is the same. It's just, at the time, it's just you're doing your job and it's having fun, or not sleeping, or whatever it is you're doing. And then years later, it's like, whoa, I was there for that.
I'd like to touch on the puppeteering versus the effects. I mean, did you always know that the two were a similar thing? I mean, you say now you prefer being more on set, so you're more involved in the puppeteering side as opposed to the effects makeup. I had no idea the two were essentially the same group of people. I didn't realize that.
Well, it depends. It depends on a lot of things. Like when I was training myself to do this stuff, I was very much drawn to things like Jaws and John Carpenter's The Thing and those kind of films where it was makeup effects, but it was not necessarily a makeup on an actor. It was a creature. It was a creature that didn't have a person inside it. It was just a puppeteered element or a puppet. And so I started building things like that on my own, my 16-year-old version of that. And, again, when I started on the X-Files, I didn't know that there was a difference between being a makeup effects guy that brought a creature to life and a puppeteer. And, at this point in my career, I've worked on a lot of different shows where we have animatronic creatures. I've worked on Aliens and Predators and those kind of things. But I've also worked with the Muppets, and that was a case of the Muppets brought a couple of smaller MOWs to Vancouver, and they were hiring locals with some skill in that area. And, I went in and said, look, I'm not a children's puppeteer. I don't do voices. I don't sing and dance. I can perform. I can bring a character to life. And as the years went by, I became more comfortable with the performance side of it. Like, as I said, sometimes you're just wiggling a tentacle, giving it life. And other times you're actually bringing a character, you are the character. And, so, there's a zone of it, like what puppeteering is and how it relates to makeup effects. But yeah, back on the X-Files, we were building animatronic things, and then somebody would have to bring it to life, and we were the first choice. And you said when I'm on set, I'm probably mostly puppeteering. My set work is either prosthetic makeup or puppeteering, or both. And that's what I focus on these days. I mean, I had a blast building stuff in the shops for X-Files, but there was a time somewhere after X-Files that I realized my main drive to do this work was a love of film and I wanted to be on set learning the craft of filmmaking, because I've since, written and directed as well. So it became my own private film school.
Nice.
So I was happy to go do the makeups or the monsters or the puppets, but I was always shadowing the directors. Like I always said, I shadowed Kim Manners every second I was on X-Files, and learned a ton from him. It was just amazing to watch him. The stories. I mean, I worked with him later on Supernatural, and there was one throwaway scene, the boys in a morgue talking to a coroner, and it was like half a page, I think, and we were going to be shooting it for maybe an hour, and he did a take, and the actress playing the coroner, it just wasn't working. There was something about it that you could tell was off, and he did another take and it just wasn't working. And I think on the third or fourth take, he went in and he said something to her. He gave her a piece of direction. It took maybe 30 seconds, and he came back and he did a fourth take, and it was 1,000 times better, and we were done. And that's directing. That's when you know exactly what to say to help the actor find where they need to get. And that was Kim in a nutshell. He knew how to adapt. I remember a scene on Supernatural where we was working with a new DP, and he would adjust his shooting style to accommodate the time that it was taking. He just always knew. But he grew up on set. He was a child actor. He was a stunt man. He was a first AD, and then later he became a director, and he had already had 10, 15, 20 years experience. So he really was a mentor and a hero of mine. You can ask anyone who worked on X-Files. They loved Kim. They praise him. Like Supernatural, every year they would, after he passed, every year they would acknowledge the day he passed. Like there was always a little photo display put up at craft service on that day, and the crew would talk about it, because the crew on Supernatural was basically built from the crew of the X-Files and Millennium.
I think we have one more question to ask you, and it's actually one that we ask everyone that we've had the opportunity to speak with. So do you have a message for the X-Files fans, old and new, from the past 27 years?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I mean, I personally haven't really revisited the X-Files. Like, it was a huge part of my life. But I can't say that I obsessively watch the episodes over and over again. I was going to say you'll have to talk me through which episodes you want to talk about, because I don't really remember them by name. But you hit on a couple of easy ones. I don't know what to say. I mean, I'm thrilled that the show still has a following, and people love it like they love the original Star Trek. I mean, one thing I could say that I've come to realize that as films and television shows get older, they can feel dated, because they were made decades ago, and technology and the approach to filmmaking has changed. But what I've kind of observed is that good films just become period pieces. Like if it's a bad movie that was shot in the 70s, it just feels old and dated, and you kind of let it go. But something that was shot in the 70s or 80s or 90s, if it's good and it's good storytelling, it holds up. It just transitions into being a period. When we made the X-Files and watched the X-Files, it was present day the X-Files. Now it's the X-Files, but it was set in the 90s. That's what it feels like. So that's what I would say to people that are maybe giving it, going back to it or looking at it for the first time. Think of it like it was set in the 90s. Don't think of it as it was old and they made it in the 90s. Just think that it was supposed to be the 90s.